Exercise set 1-6, Diagnosing Loaded Language, from a Workbook for Arguments by Morrow and Weston. The objective of this exercise set is to train yourself to recognize and avoid loaded language. A good argument should be able to stand on the strength of its premises and the connection between the premises and the conclusion. Learning to recognize loaded language helps you avoid being taken in by an argument that sounds good but lacks substance. Learning to recognize loaded language also helps you avoid giving arguments yourself that sound good but don't actually provide good reasons for their conclusions. This is kind of a common problem. There's also negative language. Loaded language comes both in negative and positive varieties. Some loaded language carries negative emotional overtones. This type of language casts the focus of the argument in a negative light. For instance, calling bankers corporate pirates attempts to cast bankers in a negative light. Other loaded language carries positive emotional overtones. For instance, calling a camp for holding prisoners of war a pacification center makes it sound good, almost like the kind of place you'd want to go for a relaxing vacation. It's important to look out for both kinds of loaded language when we're analyzing arguments. Some loaded language is subtle, and its emotional power may depend on the context in which it's used. For instance, the term Ivy League school is not necessarily emotionally charged. It refers to one of a specific group of American universities. However, imagine two politicians in a debate. If one says, "Now, I may not have gone to an Ivy League school like my opponent, but," the term Ivy League school suddenly has an air of elitism. It can make the politician's opponent seem out of touch with ordinary people. It's important to look out for subtle loaded language too. As we'll discover once we start looking out for it, it's all over the place. When it comes to suggesting less loaded ways of saying the same thing, look for terms that carry less and ideally no emotional charge. For instance, if you're talking about a Democratic politician, don't call them a member of the radical left or a do-nothing Democrat. Phrases like these mostly just play on our feelings. And given this, most would not accept these phrases as neutral descriptions, because they're not. On the other hand, you shouldn't call Democratic politicians saviors of the free world either. In classic political discourse, there is a substantive difference between Republicans and Democrats. Instead, if you're going to talk about a Democratic politician, just call them a Democratic politician. That's pretty neutral. All right, the instructions for this exercise. We're going to go through the sample exercise and then look at a couple of others from the exercise set 1-6. After I present each example, pause the video and look for loaded language in the paragraph. If the argument contains loaded language, indicate which words or phrases are loaded and suggest a less loaded way of saying the same thing. If the passage doesn't contain any loaded language, say so. I think that this one's pretty unlikely. I think that they all contain loaded language. And after each example, I'll give an explanation so we understand what's going on. Okay, so the sample. Certain irresponsible American politicians have been spewing lies about the latest attempts at reform. Whether these lies come from a combination of stupidity and hysterical imagination, or from cleverness and a willing to exploit innocent Americans for personal political gain, these lies must be exposed for the damaging falsehoods that they are. So this argument, of course, is full of loaded language. Calling the politicians irresponsible makes them sound bad without yet saying what it is that they've done wrong. It could be deleted without affecting the actual substance of the argument. Spewing lies is an emotionally evocative way of saying making false statements. Speculating about whether the lies come from stupidity and a hysterical imagination or a willingness to exploit innocent Americans makes the politician sound dumb, unstable, or evil, but it doesn't actually add any facts to support the conclusion. Even worse, it falsely suggests that stupidity and malice are the only possible motives for these politicians' statements. The whole clause can be cut out too if we're trying to reduce emotionally loaded language. The argument could claim simply that some politicians are making false statements about the latest attempts at reform, and that falsehood of those statements should be made clear to the public. This is a neutral way to say the same idea. All right, let's move on to another example. The dirty little secret behind factory farms' profits, namely that there's no good reason for their monstrously cruel mistreatment of animals, is getting out. Since morally decent people abhor senseless animal cruelty, people everywhere are turning against factory farms. Okay, so let's pause the video and look for the emotionally loaded language. Of course, this argument uses several loaded expressions. Dirty little secret, monstrously cruel mistreatment, and senseless animal cruelty all have strong negative overtones. The first two could be avoided by describing the factory farm's practices in neutral terms. For example, describing the size of the crates in which factory farm chickens are kept, leaving it to the reader to decide whether these practices are monstrously cruel or not. The expression senselessly cruel to animals could be replaced with treating animals in this way, right? So you set up the negative conditions, and then you say that animals are being treated in this way, and leave it to the reader to decide whether it's senselessly cruel or not. And finally, by saying that morally decent people abhor such practices, the argument suggests that anyone who's not outraged by factory farms is morally innocent. This might be expressed more modestly by asserting that many people believe it's wrong to treat animals in this way instead. All right, one last example. We can all agree that the defendant brought the murder weapon earlier that night. The pawn shop owner saw him buy it, and his friends saw him carrying it. So how does that switchblade end up in the old man's chest if the boy didn't kill him? Remember that imaginative little fable that the boy told? He claims that the knife fell through a hole in his pocket on his way to the movie theater. You don't really believe that, do you? The boy's a murderer, plain and simple. This argument relies on a more subtle use of loaded language, as we saw earlier. The phrase, imaginative little fable, suggests without argument that the boy's claim about losing the knife is false. Likewise, the question, you don't really believe that, do you, suggests that anyone who believes the fable is gullible or stupid. But it doesn't actually give any reasons for thinking that the boy's claim is false. All right, now move on to the rest of the exercises and remember the process for this one. So read the passage and then identify the language that you think is emotionally loaded and explain what kind of language you can replace it with.